Laura, by the way, for those that don't know, the lady with the mask on, because she's out in the open office, Temple Congregation of Beth Israel, is Laura Robinson, who's on the staff and assisting me, thank goodness, with the tech and everything for this afternoon. I thank Laura in advance.
Happy to be here.
And Steve Bilo, who's with a green shirt on, is a friend from here in the congregation, is going to help with questions also. For those that I've met before, Dory and I, my wife and I, travel back and forth between Cincinnati, where we live, and either Denver, where one of our kids and grandsons live, or here to Portland, where Rabbi Rachel's our daughter and Max our grandson. So obviously we missed everybody last year. We're here. We were here the week before Rosh Hashanah. We went to Denver to be with the other part of the family on Rosh Hashanah. Then we came back for Yom Kippur. So it's great. I just walked across the street from the family service, and it's been terrific. The weather, for those people that are not in Portland right now, the weather is gorgeous today, thank goodness, and last night. So anyway, it's great. I hope it's a better year for all of us. I hope that the people that you love and in your circle of love are as healthy as can be. If people have been sick, or God forbid, you've had friends and loved ones pass away, I can't tell you how sorry I am. And we just hope that this year for all of us is better and better. It just needs to be. So that's what we're doing. So it's become a custom over, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 years that I teach Yom Kippur afternoon for a little bit. And I joke with the rabbis here that all the teachings that I had that were canned, I ran out of them a couple of years ago. I have to do new study. So that's fun, actually, in a way, because I picked topics that I hadn't, broached before. And it made sense to me because I didn't have a deep knowledge about Judaism and how Judaism as a religion and Jews as an identity, really how they've handled epidemics down through the ages. Now, I'll tell you one thing, sort of jumping the gun a little bit, but I know that some of you may have heard a year and a half ago, in the beginning of all the bad stuff with the pandemic, that those of us that live in Ohio were blessed with a chief of the medical for the government with medicine in Ohio by a name Dr. Amy Acton, A-C-T-O-N. If you're interested, you should Google her later today or tomorrow something. She's really a fantastic person. And the New York Times a year or so ago did an amazing piece about her. She was on television almost every day in the first year or first 6 months or so, talking about the pandemic, talking about epidemics, pandemics, health, public health, trying to keep people informed and at the same time keep them calm. Now, as it went along, and federal governments and state governments more and more trying to figure out what to do with certain laws and mandates related to the pandemic, anti-Semites began to attack her. She's a member of the Jewish community in Columbus, Ohio, and they began to picket her home, and this is the point I want to get to. They carried big signs, placards, that the body was a rat and the head was Dr. Acton. But this is a very, very old trope in the anti-Semitic world because Jews were blamed for the Black Plague. And we'll talk a little bit about this today, but Jews historically around the world have been blamed for physical illnesses and this type of stuff. So I was interested in how we as Jews really tried to approach this. If you registered in advance, Laura sent you some text. When we get to use the text, for those that didn't register, we'll share the screen, right, Laura? Not yet, but we will. And I'm going to try to hold off a lot of questions for about 30 minutes or so, but I've asked Deputized Steve Bilo to, he sees a question he really thinks we should get to, he's going to interrupt me and we'll grab it. If you have a question and you don't want to forget it, write it down, put it in the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible. Great, everybody good? Yes? Great, okay. So look, we Jews know about plagues for sure, because what holiday do we celebrate that deals with the plagues?
Passover.
Passover, right. According to the book of Exodus, the first Passover took place in Egypt on the night of the 10th plague, in which God killed each and every firstborn of Egypt, man and beast, but spared the Hebrew slaves. So the response to today's pandemic, including the shutdown of houses of worship, which happened in Israel, and it hasn't happened here. There'd be a civil war here. It brings to the fore how much our view of disease and of religion itself has evolved. So look, throughout the Hebrew Bible, whenever epidemics are mentioned, it's clear that the ancient writers of the tales and the laws saw epidemics as divine punishment for sin. It's God who chooses who will die, and it's God who decides who recovers. That's a very important idea through. And of course, we're skirting all around that right now on Yom Kippur. The services today about sin and repentance, the afternoon service leading up to Nila, this theology of divine punishment for sin and God choosing is throughout. It is usually less of a problem, this theology, for those members of the Jewish world that are part of the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox world. People that are part of the non-Orthodox world tend to have, in the main, a harder time with this. We tend to feel more comfortable with what we call free will, and we make a choice rather than God making the choice. So, but this is part of this path we're going to now travel down around epidemics. So let me read a couple of verses to you from Exodus. If you will diligently hearken to the voice of God, and you will do what is right in God's sight, and you will give ear to God's commandments and keep all God's statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am God that heals you. And that's Exodus 15, verse 26. Pretty clear. Follow what I say. You're going to be, if you get sick, you're going to be healed, but you're probably not going to get sick. Do things wrong, do things bad, do things out of my sight. Watch out. Watch out. So for the ancient Hebrew, the proper response to a plague was to plead for God's mercy and plead for God's forgiveness. Again, for those of you that either were able to be at services last night or were this morning or coming this afternoon, have your ears open for this. You're going to hear it. It still finds its way into the prayer book, even though we're non-Orthodox Jews. Let's plead for God's mercy. God will forgive. You just have to be open to saying that I need that forgiveness. So when an epidemic, in the book of Numbers, an epidemic kills thousands of Israelites after Korach's rebellion against Moses and Aaron, that dying from that plague only stopped once Aaron burned incense, which assuaged God's wrath. Korach was the guy that rebelled against Moses. Eventually, Moses complained to God. The earth opened up and swallowed Korach. but the Israelites that followed Korach were struck down by a plague. And at a certain point, Aaron and Moses were so upset by this, they asked for God to stop it, and they burned this incense, and the plague stopped. So when God caused an epidemic to ravage the kingdom of Israel, there's another one. King David did a census. God told him it wasn't his job to do the census. So only the sacrifice provided by King David in a particular location and advised by a prophet named God, G-A-D, God, then our God, G-O-D, stopped the epidemic, according to the Bible. There is Jewish teaching that the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 did not weaken the conviction that the Hebrew God, the one true God, controlled epidemics. But it did change the way Jews appealed to God when disease struck. So I'll just do a quick summary. Biblical Jews, biblical Hebrews, illness, plagues, where you got God angry and you weren't following it, and you're now paying the price. And you have to figure a way to repent before you die from the plague. The temple's destroyed. The teaching is out there that God caused this, but there were ways that you could appeal to God to end the epidemic that was better than just necessarily burning the incense. We'll talk a little more about the incense in a moment. So no more could they just assuage God by an animal sacrifice. The rabbis post the temple tried to look for new procedures that were developed. And they also looked at the book of Numbers and said, you can't just assuage God by burning incense. So the Mishnah, this is the rabbinic teaching of the law. It's completed around the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Mishnah, and other rabbinical writings in the beginning of those centuries post the destruction. Again, the destruction's in the year 70. When they began to talk about how do we deal with these sicknesses. When an epidemic strikes a town or strikes a city, the first thing the rabbis tell everybody to do is communal prayer and fasting. What does that sound like? What does that remind you of? Anybody unmute and tell us?
Today.
Say it louder.
Today, Yom Kippur.
Today. Here we are. Here we are. They told us, 1,800 years ago, 700, if there's a plague, start praying and start fasting. Well, here we are. There's Jews all over the world. Now, some have already completed the day. That they're ahead of us. Europe's ahead of us. But they're fasting and they're praying. So this together, this fasting and praying with other penitential practices, such as you're supposed to abstain from bathing. You're not supposed to wear leather. Like Orthodox Jews don't wear leather shoes when young people, or they wear sneakers or that kind of stuff, because you're supposed to show mercy to animals. You're not supposed to abstain from sex. These were all thought to elicit God's forgiveness. But the rabbis were interested in what's this contagion that's going on. So today we know that there were group assemblies that got together for prayer and fasting. And what do we now call in America in the last 18 months? What do we call when big groups of people get together? What's
super
the
spreader
phrase?
events?
Say it, Sue?
Super spreader event.
Right. The rabbis didn't call it a super spreader. I don't know how you they probably say in Hebrew, super spreader. They didn't call it a super spreader, but they figured it out. It probably wasn't a good idea. It's more likely to spread the disease than to stop it. But there actually is no hint in early rabbinic writings that they understood diseases as having a natural cause, or they had any awareness that illness could be contagious, or that disease had natural causes. These ideas didn't begin to emerge in Western thinking until the time of the Romans. And it began to spread around with the Romans. Certainly they had some of this idea in the Talmudic ages, the 3rd to 5th century, but even in the Talmudic era, the idea that one should take an action to avoid disease is not mainstream, only appearing rarely in massive Jewish legal corpus, or often it's contradicted somewhere else. There is one place in the Talmud, I'll just give you the citation because I know there's some people that'll possibly look for it later. It's in the tractate called Bava Kama, B-A-V-A, or sometimes Baba, B-A-B-A, B-A-B-A or B-A-V-A, comma, K-A-M-A, Bava Kama, number 60B. And the rabbis advise that during a plague, listen to this, one should stay at home, adding that the 4th century Babylonian rabbi, whose name was Rava, kept his windows shut during an epidemic. It's interesting that they had that. The Talmud goes on to advise that when traveling during an epidemic, one should stick to the sides of the road rather than walk down the middle, as in other times. Now, assuming that the middle of the road was busier than the shoulders, it's probably not bad advice. Even if the logic given for it was this, the rabbi said, that's the angel of death who usually travels on the side of the road. So you should normally avoid that part of the road and walk down the middle of the road in the times of the plague. So I have this picture of people trying to understand this. They're like zigzagging, trying to stay away from the crowds of the people in the middle and stay away from the angel of death on the sides. But the fact that the rabbis are trying to figure out how can you travel and not catch the plague. At times, the Talmud seems to argue that the concept that diseases does try to talk about the disease being contagious. The Talmud calls on Jews to avoid the urge to distance yourselves from disease and trust in God. I'll say that again, because you may have heard somebody in the last 18 months talk like this. If you want to just, we're concerned about the disease of contagious, but distance yourself from the trust in God. God will take care of you. There is one section in the Talmud where we're told that the students of a 2nd century sage, Rabbi Akiva, refused to visit one of their number who had fallen ill. We're told that Akiva went to visit that student himself and that Akiva recovered, prompting Akiva to teach that visiting the sick helps them recover. And thus, those who refuse to visit the sick are as guilty as those who spill blood. Think about that, right? A student is sick. The students are afraid to go visit that person because they have some idea he may catch it. The teacher says, visiting sick is the most important mitzvah. Go visit the person. Akiva gets somewhat sick, but is recovered. He says he recovered because he followed such an important mitzvah. And if you don't do this mitzvah, it's like you killed somebody. Wow. So the rabbis actually decreed that it is a Jewish obligation to visit the sick based on the biblical precedent that God visited Abraham when he was recovering from his circumcision. And even to this day, in the Jewish world, visiting the sick is considered one of the most important commandments. Now, in the entire collection that is the Talmud, we only find one section in which the rabbis seem to advise that contagious disease is to be avoided. But even here, the point of the story seems to be that it's folly. So here it is. It's from Ketubot 77b. It describes a mysterious affliction that's called in Aramaic ra'atan. And it causes, the rabbis say, watery eyes, runny nose, drooling, skin lesions, and it attracts flies. There's been a ton of PhDs in the 20th century, in the 21st century, trying to say, what is this disease? Obviously it's some sort of skin disease, and some people tried to prove it's leprosy. We don't know. But according to the Talmud, the disease is caused by the afflicted. By the way, I had to study what I'm now going to tell you because it's so weird. How do you get this terrible disease? Your parents do bloodletting for some reason, right? Everybody knows bloodletting. Like you bleed yourself because it's going to make you have some sickness, and if you let some bloodletting happen, it's going to heal you. If your parents conceive you soon after they did bloodletting, this child is going to have this terrible disease. The Talmud advises, here's the treatment for this disease. Everybody ready? I should have sent this when this disease started for one of the presidential press conferences. It's as good as Clorox and horseworming and whatever. Okay, here it goes. Here it is. Make a potion of grass, add to the grass nutshells, hide shavings, mugworts, and date flowers. Apply all this to the patient's head, and it will soften his skull. Cut the skull open and remove where you see the illness, and you're going to see at least one or more insects lodged in the brain in that portion. Take them out with myrtle leaves and tweezers. Burn the insects, otherwise they will find their way into another patient's brain. Okay. Now, one thing that I learned in preparation for being with you is this may be one of the earliest citations that we know of in writing of some sort of anesthesia and neurosurgery. We're not saying, we don't know how many people died, right? It's doubtful this is successful at all, but did anybody survive it? But the idea that they were thinking about doing this. The Talmud elaborates on the measures the rabbis took to avoid catching it. Rabbi Yochanan avoided flies that sat on those that were plagued by the disease. Rabbi Zera wouldn't sit downwind from anyone who had the disease. Rabbi Elazar wouldn't enter the tent of somebody who had this disease. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi wouldn't even eat an egg that they saw on the street where somebody was afflicted lived on that street. These are all methods probably intended to seem ridiculous and are contrasted with the actions of Rabbi Yehoshua, who would go visit those suffering of this disease and study Torah with them, because he wrote, Torah bestows grace on those who learn it. Does it not protect them from the illness? So this continued, this idea. Yet as time went by, the view that epidemics had natural causes and the disease was contagious took a hold among prominent rabbis, augmenting the Bible and the Talmud. And by the high Middle Ages, which is around the year 1000 to the year 1200, these views were taken for granted by prominent rabbis. For example, in the 13th century in Spain, Nachmanides, he explains that Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt to stop her from her blasphemous thoughts from spreading, quote, like the plague and infectious diseases that are carried in the air. That's 13th century. So he's making the analogy between Lot's wife and diseases through the air. He had a contemporary in the 13th century, Rabbi Bachia, who explains that the plague that was caused by Korach's rebellion, remember, the earth swallowed him up and all these people were killed by a plague. He says that Aaron separated Korach's company from the rest of the Israelites so that the bad air of the plague wouldn't stick to the people that were against Korach. Clearly, Bachia subscribed to some sort of miasma theory of disease, which really remained in vogue until the 19th century, for a long time. But these realizations didn't lead to any new methods for limiting the spread of disease just yet. Instead, the 13th century saw the appearance of new methods to stop epidemics. One thing that the rabbis heavily rely upon to this day is the reading of ancient legal texts that describe the particular methods used by the priests of the Second Temple. And one of those methods is burning incense. As said, the book of Numbers says the plague was stopped by Aaron since he burned incense. Since the temple's no more, Jews aren't supposed to burn incense to God, but as with other temple-related acts of worship, rabbinic Judaism, post the temple, added these texts into the ritual that would show up in the prayer book. There's another 13th century in Spain idea that relates to a legend about a 4th century rabbi called Aha, A-H-A, who arrived at a town that was ravaged by a plague, an epidemic. The townsfolk asked for his advice, and he tells them to assemble the 40 most pious men in the synagogue. After they studied the Talmudic passages concerning the incense in groups of 10, each of the 4 corners of the synagogue, the epidemic stopped, according to his writing. The ceremony that this passage inaugurated began to spread throughout the Jewish world, and believe it or not, it's been used in ultra-Orthodox synagogues in the last 18 months. Groups of 10 study in a different quarter in the synagogue, and when they finish the tractate, they burn incense, and it's going to keep the COVID from spreading. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, Jews died in great numbers. And though it's oft repeated that Jews died in lower numbers than the Christian neighbors, there's little evidence that this is true. Possibly the idea that Jews were for some reason less susceptible to the disease was a rationalization to explain why Christians reacted to the Black Death by indiscriminately slaughtering Jews. And as I said, epidemics to this day are often lead to the persecution of Jews and to other minorities in certain societies. So let me talk a little bit, and soon we'll get to the point where everybody can have comments about science arising. More scientific methods to contain the spread of disease began to be adopted in the thinking of the 16th century Rabbi Shmuel ben Moses, also a rabbi who was writing from Thessalonica in Greek, mentions in passing in a legal decision concerning an inheritance that the deceased suffered a kind of disease that those who suffer of are not visited. It seems that in at least some communities, the requirement to visit the sick was lifted in the case if you felt it was an infectious disease. You weren't required to visit the sick. Not that this is universally accepted. A famous Rabbi Moses Isserlis, Polish, 16th century Krakow, wrote a legal decision about a man trying to get out of a contract to rent an apartment when he found out that the guy who owned the apartment's wife died from an infectious disease in the apartment that's now being rented. And Isserlis says, what the man says is that an infectious disease, what this man says about infectious disease is utterly nonsense. And anyone who's moved by his heart says so, because it is the Lord who sickens and heals. If we found, according to the opinion of the renter, that all laws concerning the visiting sick would be nullified, then we wouldn't be any distinction between infectious disease and non-infectious disease, except for the matter of the plague of Radan. So I don't agree. The guy should rent the apartment. This was further went on to say, in this case, that the disease in question was everywhere in the city and no home was exempt anyway. So this guy isn't going to find a place to rent in a town that hasn't had a disease in it. Things began to change in the 19th century. when cholera arrived in Europe. It was during the cholera outbreaks of the 1830s that the first experiments with social distancing took place, with many municipalities banning large gatherings. In 1831, Rabbi Akiva of Poznan, Poland, called on Jews to limit the numbers of congregants praying in the synagogue to 15 men. Concerning the matter of prayer in a synagogue, it's my opinion that it's true that the assembling in a small place is incorrect, but it's permissible to pray group after group, each time a little bit, about 15 people. Rabbi Akiva even went as far as to permit a police officer to be stationed at the entrance to the synagogue to ensure that the limit of 15 men in the synagogue would not be exceeded. Similarly, during the cholera epidemic that struck Lithuania in 1848, the important Rabbi Israel Salanter permitted Jews to carry out relief work on the Sabbath, even went as far as telling his congregants not to fast on Yom Kippur. During the Spanish flu of 1918, municipalities around the world banned gatherings, and some synagogues held services outdoors. Some, apparently even suspended services during the height of the Spanish flu. But these measures pale in comparison to the adjustments we've been trying to make as Jews and people during this COVID pandemic. While rabbis have been advising penitential prayers, I'm talking in the ultra-Orthodox community, be added to the daily prayers, as well as reading of the Talmudic text concerning the burning of incense, the closing of synagogues in such a large scale, including in Israel and some in the US, by far the two largest Jewish communities, is completely unprecedented. An analysis of the places appearing on the health ministries in Israel's coronavirus contact tracing studies shows that in Israel, more than 40% of those infected in public spaces visited synagogues and yeshivas and were exposed to the virus in the synagogue and yeshiva. Now, there's a report that was recently released in Israel, and it was one that was coming from B'nai Brak. I will read the question about the anti-vaccine. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, B'nai Brak, for those of you who don't know, is a town, a city in Israel, not far from Tel Aviv. It's the center of the ultra-Orthodox world, this B'nai Brak. And it has been the most major Jewish Israeli coronavirus hotspot in Israel. They put up notices around town that said in Hebrew, by order of the health ministry, this synagogue is closed. By order of the health ministry of Israel, this health ministry is closed. The next day, there were placards under each of those health ministry signs. The placards were written with 3 sentences in Yiddish that said, okay, the way I have to read it is it continues the health ministry. So the health ministry said, by order of the health ministry, the study hall is closed. And then the Yiddish said, according to the government, period. But we say this study hall and this synagogue is open. So come to learn and you should come to pray. We've had big problems in New York City with the same stuff.
Did they stay open?
The government comes and shuts it down, and they look for other ways to get around it and keep it open. This is why, one of the reasons why Israel has been so strong of getting everybody vaccinated and now giving the boosters. And they're making it very difficult to participate in daily life without proof of it. You can't go into stores, businesses, doctors, all kinds of stuff without showing that your passport, that's your vaccination passport. The rabbis in Israel who accepted containment measures have called on their congregations to comply with the ban, adding the sad fact that communal prayer and penance, which Jews have used for millennia, are not only ineffective, but are counterproductive. But this has been a huge problem in Israel. And we know that there's an article, it's either yesterday, I didn't look at today's Times, I think it was yesterday's Times, about looking for religious exemptions from getting the vaccine. Am I right? Did anybody read the article? Right. So in a country like ours, where the idea of religious freedom, whatever that means, and where individual rights, whatever that means, are so deeply embedded in the DNA of the country, it makes it really, really, really complicated. Israel is a country like others where the government has a tremendous amount of clout of closing and opening things. Everybody's in the military, an awful lot of ultra-Orthodox in the military. So it's a tremendous, tremendous problem. There was a question that went by. Somebody had her up on the chat. I don't know if Steve put it in or Laura, about anti-vax and anti-mask. So, yes.
So Stephanie wanted to know if you can speak to the anti-vax and anti-mask movement in the context of Jewish history.
Right.
And if that somehow justifies their stance against public health measures.
Right.
And we assume their stance means.
Wait, say it again, Steve.
I'm assuming that when he says their stance against, that she's referring to the ultra-Orthodox community's stance against.
Yep, I'm assuming. So in the ultra-Orthodox community, and some of you, there may be people that are with us in the group today that lived in this community or grew up in this community, has knowledge of it, some not. The ultra-Orthodox community, part of the way that they live their lives, they do follow the strictures of Jewish law, but the interpretation of that law and commentary of that law is given to them by their core or key rabbi. If any of you have watched any of the TV shows that have been on Netflix and stuff the last couple of years about unorthodox and all you get ideas about this. There are in both America and in Israel some very, very, very conservative with a small c and very strict interpreters of Jewish law that are powerful rabbis of certain communities. And that rabbi's word is law to them. What it means by law is not that they're going to go to jail, but they're not going to go to heaven. I mean, they're going to die. They're going to die sooner than later. In God's wrath, they're going to be punished. And they will not, because it's not like heaven in the Christian sense. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far about heaven, but the idea is if you die with God's wrath, it means that you won't be resurrected when the Messiah comes. That's the most important thing, because you realize in the ultra-Orthodox community, they believe in bodily resurrection and when the Messiah comes, and that we will all be resurrected. We will, if you lived a righteous life, you will be judged righteous and then you will live forever. If you don't, if you're judged unrighteous or sinful, you disappear forever. So if you've been indoctrinated in this from the moment you were born, you're indoctrinated with your mother's milk in this way of this worldview. So if that rabbi says that you're not to get the vaccine, you're not to put that into your body, and he quotes from the Talmud or whatever lines of Bible that he feels says you shouldn't put something in your body, you're not going to do it. And if he says that you don't need to be wearing a mask in here, I have not done a search, and I should have, but you guys could do it, an hour later, a Google of what's been the ultra-Orthodox approach to masking would be very interesting. I'm guessing that they'll allow masking in public places where you have to, and then when you're in Jewish private places, all bets are off. That's my guess. Unless there's some yeshiva and a lot of people died in the yeshiva and they said, we better do this. That's also possible that what could happen. So
It looks like
Okay,
there was
so,
a follow-up question. Oh,
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
Oh, so yeah, it looks like there was a follow-up question to the first one. So she said that there are anti-vax individuals who accuse physicians who believe in the vaccine and masks as, quote, Nazis, memes implying that vaccine cards are like an armband, I think similarly to World War II. Do you have thoughts on that?
Right. I have personal thoughts. I don't have any, which I'll share. I don't have any, I think, deeply reflected thoughts more than that. I am personally deeply pained, to say the least, when a non-Jew starts talking about Nazi behavior. I am ready to blow up when a Jew uses it against ourselves. In other words, there have been instances, unfortunately, especially things that have happened in Israel, where the ultra-Orthodox will call the government or call non-Orthodox Jews Nazis and all kinds of stuff. It's very painful to me and very, to say the least, too glib to use that kind of talking. I actually don't know what to say that doesn't sound deeply mean-spirited. I don't want to do that on Yom Kippur already. I don't want to sin before the day's over. Maybe I should, then I still have time to repent for it before sundown.
We do have another question that came in.
Yep.
Could you speak more about the history of why Jews were accused of causing pandemics?
Right. You know, we've been accused, excuse me, again, we have been accused, especially in what I've been calling sort of the Western world. That is, I'm not looking about Jewish life in Asia or Jewish life in what later became Arab countries, etc. But excuse me, Jewish life in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, and in those centuries, with the Roman Empire leading into what became the Roman Catholic world, and later added to that the Protestant world. You know, there's been no end, and most of us that are here this afternoon have studied about it, talked about it, read about different ways anti-Semitism is played out. And we were accused for a number of reasons. First thing, in the Middle Ages, the popes of that time would not allow a Catholic to be a physician. It was against their theology to cut into the body, etc. The physicians in the early Middle Ages were either Jews or Arabs. Anybody know the name of a very famous Jewish physician in the Middle Ages, 13th century, 12th, 13th century, is also a most important scholar? Maimonides. Maimonides, those of you that, for all of you, yeah, a brilliant, he wrote a commentary on a very important book of the Jewish tradition and was a doctor. He was hired by sovereigns in the Arab world to be their physician. So we were an easy target. Just like, you know, parentheses, we were money lenders, because you couldn't be a money lender in the Middle Ages if you were Catholic, and the Jews, it was considered dirty and sinful. And that led to why we're considered money grubbers and rich, and all those tropes come from 1,000 years ago of what the church forced us to do. So so this idea of, and Jews were also parts of the anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages on, included that Jews were dirty. If you're dirty, you carry contagion. I mean, we know where the Black Death came from today. Anybody know? Came from fleas that infested rats, probably from Asia, and came by ships into Europe. So this idea of, Jews can do all this stuff that's unholy as far as they're concerned. And you see some of these same things, and I am not saying in any way that a caring, believing Christian in American society is saying this, but we see it coming out of some of what I think are the crazy white supremacists using some of these same ideas and, as I say, tropes and language that's there. Absolutely, it's hard. Sherry has a hand up. I don't see Sherry, but I do see that she did it.
She does have her hand up. There she is.
Okay.
Hi. During that time of that plague, when Jews were blamed for the bubonic plague.
Yeah, talk a little bit louder, Sherry, please.
I seem to be having audio issues today.
Oh, do we? All of us do?
Yeah.
No, just Sherry.
No, just Sherry.
Okay.
Okay, so they killed all the cats in the city, believing cats in London were the witches' mediums. So actually created a rat overpopulation, creating that plague, because religiously they wanted to kill the witches' mediums and then blamed the Jews.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right.
So
Looks
Rabbi,
like-
Yeah, Steve.
oh, actually, I think Laura was just going to read it. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. You have too many people that want to help read these questions. Sally asked, how do you think synagogues will change post-pandemic?
Sally, you're too sneaky. Hi, Sally. So obviously everybody knows this is moving away from literally the plagues. This is such a long discussion. I have to think of just a couple things to say. I think what the pandemic has, let me see where to start. I'm sorry, I'm mumbling a little as I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I'll use one thing as an example. I have, for some of you know that I'm been a professor for 40 years at HEC in the area of my doctorate's in organizational psychology and what makes an excellent organization. And I've been talking to synagogues for at least 5 or more years, all around North America, of the idea of how do we use the gifts of technology, of the internet, etc. I was talking with Laura before we got on that I've been teaching in a remote graduate program online synchronously for 10 years. But I had no traction at all until the pandemic. And most synagogues I visited, the technology they used in the sanctuary was clearly something that had been returned to Radio Shack. I mean, it was just terrible stuff. Now, the so-called pivot, where everybody had to realize, how do we reach out? This was now talking 18 months ago. And then when you watch, for those of you that had done any surfing during the High Holy Days, last year, Dory and I were not able to be here in Portland. So, we shul hopped all over North America. I can tell you that, and I haven't had a chance to, it doesn't matter. Last year, watching CBI, and we were in Denver with our other daughter and grandkids at Rosh Hashanah. Watching CBI this year, Rosh Hashanah, was infinitely better. The production value, it could get better and better. I'm not saying it couldn't, there's more, but the production value, everything about it. So get into what Sally says, I think that synagogues have a great opportunity in front of them. One is to think about our operating model just as how we do it, because there's nothing bad about a hybrid model like what's happening in Portland today. 300 people across the street that way, and how many who we don't know either in Portland or other places that are watching and taking advantage, or people that were this morning live, mask to mask, and this afternoon it's better for them to be home, whatever. People, think of all the studying and seminars and webinars and everything that you can take advantage of all over the world, synchronously and asynchronously, which synagogues railed against. By the way, the only people who really want to be face-to-face all the time are old farts. People that are in their mid-30s and younger aren't dying to get together face-to-face every time there's synagogue. Unless you're at a place where you have to crowd in on Friday night because there's so many young people. There's not too many of those places. Now, Sally, what this also means is thinking about how do we train professionals? I mean, what's a synagogue look like 5 years from now? What do rabbis and educators and cantors look like? How do we do the technology? And all this has big implications for what's the funding model of the synagogue. Because we fund now based on bar and bar mitzvah, mostly. Did I say that? And some high holy days. So now many congregations have done amazing stuff with long distance b'nai mitzvah. Anybody have an idea? There's been a little bit of study. Anybody have an idea of what's been considered by rabbis in the non-Orthodox world as the most successful long distance life cycle event this past year and a half? It's successful in the sense of
Minions.
Yeah, what kind of minions?
Shiva minions.
Shiva.
Yeah.
Shiva has been, I mean, it's weird to say fabulous, but Shiva has been fabulous. People that could never be there were there. People actually talk about the deceased and not instead of just stuffing their face and leaving. There's all kinds of stuff. It's been amazing. Shiva has been amazing. I'm guaranteed Shiva will always have a long distance component from now on. Whether if we figure out the technology a little better, funerals will have a long distance for people that can't make it. So Sally, I think there's a lot of really interesting questions. The question I ask, and this is a question, not answer. I'm being Jewish. I'm giving your question a question, which is actually what is the nature of a synagogue 5 or 6 years from now, non-Orthodox? What's that about? What's it like? For example, you know what the other thing we figured out? We figured out that you don't have to be Jewish and do everything at the same place and at the same time. Right now it proves it, right? If we didn't have this and I was teaching downstairs, there's a chapel called Poland Chapel. I can't remember. Is it the Poland Chapel?
Correct, yeah.
If I was teaching downstairs in Poland and you guys had to be where you are, you wouldn't have this time, this hour. So same place, same time doesn't have to be. Right? I mean, Marilyn just wrote something I think is important. I mean, all this are great insights. The fight is going to be, can the current leadership care about and hold the hands and support people that are in their late 60s to 120 who aren't used to this, and then at the same time be building for the next generations. Because I hope we all live to 120, which is what we're supposed to. But even if we all do, there will be a time when we're not around. And there will be generations after us. And we have to be thinking about how they're going to approach their Jewish life. So look, I know people are going to be going in a minute. I'll ask, I said some of you did get the text, which I called this, right? And we may be able to figure out how to get it on some archive or something. I don't know if CBI has a document thing, but we'll find out, see if you can get to it. If the other way to do it is this, I can send it to you. My email if you want the document, I'll send it to you, is S Joseph, Joseph, S Joseph, Sam Joseph, at huc.edu. Laura just shared the file, she said.
Yep, it should be in the chat, if you want to download it from
There's
here.
a link
or-
in the chat. Click on it, it's yours. Thank you. Well, isn't it great that somebody that actually knows what they're doing technologically? So, listen, I hope it's a good year. We all need it desperately. I look forward to seeing my Portland friends face to face sooner than later. Gamar Chatima Tova, may it be a good inscription for everybody. Thank you, Robin. And where's Debbie Kamen? Did she have to go on? But all kinds of, so it's great. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for doing.
Leslie Robinson's a great old friend. Great to see you guys. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Wonderful.
Sam.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Thank you.
Don't do something
Thank you,
silly.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Hey,
Thank you,
Sam,
Rabbi.
it's 42 years here.
Amazing.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you from Tide Valley.